A friend was living in the town of Kurobane in the province of Nasu. There was a wide expanse of grass moor, and the town was on the other side of it. I decided to follow a shortcut which ran straight for miles and miles across the moor. I noticed a small village in the distance, but before I reached it, rain began to fall and darkness closed in. I put up at a solitary farmer's house for the night and started again early next morning. As I was plodding through the grass, I noticed a horse grazing by the roadside and a farmer cutting grass with a sickle. I asked him to do me the favor of lending me his horse. The farmer hesitated for a while, but finally, with a touch of sympathy in his face, he said to me, "There are hundreds of crossroads in the grass moor. A stranger like you can easily go astray. This horse knows the way. You can send him back when he won't go any further." So I mounted the horse and started off, when two small children came running after me. One of them was a girl named Kasane, which means manifold. I thought her name was somewhat strange, but exceptionally beautiful. If your name, Kasane, means manifold, how befitting it is for a double-flowered pink. By and by I came to a small village. I therefore sent back the horse, with a small amount of money tied to the saddle. I arrived safely at the town of Kurobane and visited my friend Joboji, who was then looking after the mansion of his lord in his absence. He was overjoyed to see me so unexpectedly, and we talked for days and nights together. His brother, Tosui, seized every opportunity to talk with me, accompanied me to his home, and introduced me to his relatives and friends. One day we took a walk to the suburbs. We saw the ruins of an ancient dog shooting ground and pushed further out into the grass moor to see the tomb of Lady Tamamo and the famous Hachiman shrine, upon whose god the brave archer Yoichi is said to have called for aid when he was challenged to shoot a single fan suspended over a boat drifting offshore. We came home after dark. I was invited out to Komyoji Temple to visit the hall in which was enshrined the founder of Shugen sect. He is said to have traveled all over the country in wooden clogs, preaching his doctrines. Amid mountains of high summer, I bowed respectfully before the tall clogs of a statue, asking a blessing of my journey. There was a Zen temple called Uganji in this province. The priest Bashō used to live in isolation in the mountains behind the temple. He once told me that he had written the following poem upon the rock of his hermitage, with the charcoal he had made from pine. This grassy hermitage, hardly any more than 5 feet square, I would gladly quit but for the rain. A group of young people accompanied me to the temple. They talked so cheerfully along the way that I reached it before I knew it. The temple was situated on the side of a mountain completely covered with dark cedars and pines. A narrow road trailed up the valley, between banks of dripping moss, leading us to the gate of the temple across a bridge. The air was still cold, though it was April. I went behind the temple to see the remains of the priest Bashō's hermitage. It was a tiny hut propped against the base of a huge rock. I felt as if I were in the presence of the priest Genmyo's cell or the priest Hun's retreat. I hung on a wooden pillar of the cottage the following poem which I wrote impromptu. Even the woodpeckers have left it untouched, this tiny cottage in a summer grove. Taking leave of my friend in Kurobane, I started for the murder stone, so called because it killed birds and insects that approached it. I was riding a horse my friend had lent me when the farmer who led the horse asked me to compose a poem for him. His request came to me as a pleasant surprise. Turn the head of your horse sideways across the field to let me hear the cry of a cuckoo. The murder stone was in a dark corner of a mountain near a hot spring and was completely wrapped in the poisonous gas rising from it. There was such a pile of dead bees, butterflies, and other insects that the real color of the ground was hardly discernible. I went to see the willow tree which Sagyo celebrated in his poem when he wrote, spreading its shade over a crystal stream. I found it near the village of Ashino on the bank of a rice field. I had been wondering in my mind where this tree was situated, for the ruler of this province had repeatedly talked to me about it. But this day, for the first time in my life, I had an opportunity to rest my worn-out legs under its shade. When the girls had planted a square of paddy field, I stepped out of the shade of a willow tree. After many days of solitary wandering, I came at last to the barrier gate of Shirakawa, which marks the entrance to the northern regions. Here, for the first time, my mind was able to gain a certain balance and composure. No longer a victim to pestering anxiety, so it was with a mild sense of detachment that I thought about the ancient traveler who had passed through this gate with a burning desire to write home. This gate was counted among the 3 largest checking stations, and many poets had passed through it, each leaving a poem of his own making. I myself walked between trees laden with thick foliage, with the distant sound of autumn wind in my ears, and the vision of autumn tints before my eyes. There were hundreds and thousands of pure white blossoms of unohana in full bloom on either side of the road, in addition to the equally white blossoms of brambles, so that the ground, at a glance, seemed to be covered with early snow. According to the accounts of Kiyosuke, the ancients are said to have passed through this gate, dressed up in their best clothes. Decorating my hair with white blossoms of unohana, I walked through the gate, my only gala dress. Written by Sora. Pushing towards the north, I crossed the river Abukuma and walked between the high mountains of Aizu on the left and the 3 villages of Iwaki, Soma, and Miharu on the right, which were divided from the villages of Hitachi and Shimotsuke districts by a range of low mountains. I stopped at the shadow pond, so called because it was thought to reflect the exact shadow of any object that approached its shore. It was a cloudy day, however, and nothing but the gray sky was reflected in the pond. I called on the poet Tokyu at the post of Sukagawa and spent a few days at his house. He asked me how I had fared at the gate of Shirakawa. I had to tell him that I had not been able to make as many poems as I wanted, partly because I had been absorbed in the wonders of the surrounding countryside and the recollections of ancient poets. It was deplorable, however, to have passed the gate of Shirakawa without a single poem worth recording, so I wrote the first poetic venture I came across, the rice-planting songs of the far north. Using this poem as a starting piece, we made 3 books of linked verse. There was a huge chestnut tree on the outskirts of this post town, and a priest was living in seclusion under its shade. When I stood there in front of the tree, I felt as if I were in the midst of the deep mountains where the poet Saigyo had picked nuts. I took a piece of paper from my bag and wrote as follows. The chestnut is a holy tree, for the Chinese ideograph for chestnut is tree placed directly below west, the direction of the Holy Land. The priest Gyoki is said to have used it for his walking stick and the chief support of his house. The chestnut by the eaves, in magnificent bloom, passes unnoticed by men of this world. Passing through the town of Hiwada, which was about 5 miles from the house of the poet Tokyo, I came to the famous hills of Asaka. The hills were not very far from the high road and scattered with numerous pools. It was the season of a certain species of iris called katsumi, so I went to look for it. I went from pool to pool, asking every soul I met on the way where I could possibly find it. But strangely enough, no one had ever heard of it, and the sun went down before I caught even a glimpse of it. I cut across to the right at Nihonmatsu, saw the ancient cave of Kuruzuka in a hurry, and put up for the night in Fukushima. On the following morning I made my way to the village of Shinobu to look at the stone upon whose checkered face they used to dye a certain type of cloth called shinobuzuri. I found the stone in the middle of a small village, half buried in the ground. According to the child who acted as a self-appointed guide, this stone was once on the top of a mountain. But the travelers who came to see it did so much harm to the crops that the farmers thought it a nuisance and thrust it down into the valley, where it rests now with its checkered face downward. I thought the story was not altogether unbelievable. The busy hands of rice-planting girls, reminiscent somehow of the old dyeing technique. Crossing the ferry of Moon Halo, I came to the post town of Rapids Head. The ruined house of the brave warrior Sato was about 1.5 miles from this post towards the foot of the mountains on the left. I pushed my way towards the village of Izuka and found a hill called Maruyama in the open fields of Sabano. This was the site of the warrior's house. I could not refrain from weeping when I saw the remains of the front gate at the foot of the hill. There was a lonely temple in the vicinity, and tombs of the Sato family were still standing in the graveyard. I wept bitterly in front of the tombstones of the 2 young wives, remembering how they had dressed up their frail bodies in armor after the death of their husbands. In fact, I felt as if I were in the presence of the weeping tombstone of China. I went into the temple to have a drink of tea. Among the treasures of the temple were the sword of Lord Yoshitsune and the satchel which his faithful retainer Benkei had carried on his back. Proudly exhibit, with flying banners, the sword and the satchel this May festival day. I wrote this poem because it was the 1st of May. I stopped overnight at Iizuka. I had a bath in a hot spring before I took shelter at an inn. It was a filthy place with rough straw mats spread out on an earth floor. They had to prepare my bed by the dim light of the fire, for there was not even a lamp in the whole house. A storm came upon us towards midnight, and between the noise of thunder and leaking rain and the raids of mosquitoes and fleas, I could not get a wink of sleep. Furthermore, an attack of my old complaint made me so ill that I left the inn upon the first hint of light in the morning. I suffered severely from repeated attacks while I rode on horseback bound for the town of Kori. It was indeed a terrible thing to be so ill on the road, when there still remained thousands of miles before me, but thinking that if I were to die on my way to the extreme north, it would only be the fulfillment of Providence. I trod the earth as firmly as possible and arrived at the barrier gate of Okido in the province of Date.